The morning began like any other in the village of Street. Mead sunlight streaming gently through lace curtains, a faint mist still clinging to the hedgerows, and the smell of bread and bacon drifting lazily through the lanes. At precisely 8:30, Mrs. Finch opened her front window to shake out the crumbs from breakfast, and in doing so, noticed something odd across the street. Mr. Gerald Pike, the village butcher, was standing outside his shop without his apron, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, staring at the door as if he had never seen it before. He held no knife in his hand, a rare sight, for Pike was known to polish his cleavers before most had finished their tea. He looked pale, his jaw tight, and his right hand twitched as though reaching for something that was no longer there. By 9, the whole village had heard that something was amiss. The butcher's shop, Pike's Meats and Provisions, had not opened, though the blinds were half drawn and a light burned steadily inside. Old Mr. Tufnell from the post office said he saw Pike standing by the door for a full 15 minutes, muttering to himself before vanishing round the back. A few whispered that it was his heart again, or perhaps a quarrel with his apprentice. Others thought it might have to do with Mrs. Pike, who had gone to visit her sister in Exeter and, according to the baker's wife, had not sent a single postcard in over a week. At 9:45, Constable Dawlish was sent to check. He found the door locked from the inside, but through the glass could see the faint shape of something lying behind the counter, something still, dark, and strangely out of place among the gleaming hooks. Within minutes, half the high street was gathered outside, whispering in sharp, breathless tones. Someone ran to fetch Dr. Heywood, and someone else, less helpfully, began speculating about bloodstains. Miss Marple, who had been quietly deadheading roses in her front garden, was one of the last to hear. She put down her shears, straightened her hat, and walked toward the gathering. Her gait was calm, her eyes mild, yet there was a peculiar alertness about her, the faint spark that lit whenever she sensed that something human and rather unfortunate. By the time she arrived, Constable Dawlish had forced the side door open. The smell hit first, not sharp like blood, but oddly metallic, mixed with the faint sweetness of cooling meat. And there, behind the counter, lay young Harold Price, Pike's apprentice, flat on his back, eyes open, the faintest trace of crimson at his collar. Gerald Pike stood motionless beside him, one hand on the counter, the other empty and trembling. "I don't understand," he kept saying, as though to no one in particular. "It isn't my knife. I swear to you. It isn't mine." Miss Marple did not speak. She merely tilted her head, her gaze settling briefly on the floorboards, the open ledger, and the peculiar absence of any knives at all. For a moment, the village seemed to hold its breath. Then she whispered, half to herself, "How very odd indeed, a butcher who forgets his own knife." The crowd outside Pike's shop had thinned by noon, leaving behind only the restless hum of rumor. Constable Dawlish stood awkwardly in the doorway, his helmet pushed back, and his notebook trembling slightly in his hand as he tried to record statements that contradicted one another at every turn. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had positioned herself near the window display, where strings of sausages hung like silent witnesses. Her eyes lingered on the dust along the counter's edge, the streak where a cleaver once rested, and the faint smear of something darkened but not fresh near the cash drawer. She said nothing. When Dr. Heywood emerged from behind the curtain, wiping his spectacles, she simply watched his face. "It's clear enough," he said to the constable in a low, uneasy tone. The boy's neck was cut clean, deliberate, and not recent. I'd say 2 or 3 hours ago. His glance fell on Pike, who sat slumped on a stool, his apron limp across his knees. "He's in no state to explain much." Pike looked up then, hollow-eyed. "I told you, Doctor. I opened the door and found him like that. My knife, it's missing, the one I've had since my father's time." His voice cracked faintly, then steadied. "But that one," he gestured weakly toward the counter where a smaller blade had been found, the kind used for trimming fat. That's not mine. I've never seen it before. Miss Marple's brows rose just slightly. Such things are often borrowed, I've found, she said in her mild way. People are remarkably careless with what doesn't belong to them. The constable barely heard her. He was scribbling something about the missing knife, trying to keep pace with the murmuring villagers pressing back toward the doorway. By early afternoon, word had spread to every corner of Street Mead. At the vicarage, Mrs. Lorimer insisted that Pike had always been temperamental, that she'd once heard shouting from the shop over the price of mutton. At the tea rooms, Mrs. Finch whispered that Harold Price had lately taken too much interest in Mrs. Pike's absence. Even the grocer, who prided himself on neutrality, muttered that Pike had been behaving oddly for days, distracted, forgetful, and often seen locking the shop early. Miss Marple, moving quietly through these currents of gossip, collected every detail as if sorting flowers for an arrangement. She neither contradicted nor encouraged, merely nodded and smiled. Yet inwardly she noted patterns, how people remembered what served their suspicions and ignored what contradicted them, and how swiftly the town decided that guilt must rest with the one who looked most bewildered by the whole affair. That evening, as twilight settled over the cobblestones, she walked past the butcher's once more. The constable had gone, the body removed, and Pike had been taken home under watch. A faint, metallic scent still drifted from the open door. On impulse, she paused and stepped inside. The shop was dim now, the last of the light slanting through the upper panes, falling across the counter. She ran a gloved finger along the wooden edge where the boy had fallen. The grain was rough, stained with years of use. Near the ledger lay a scrap of paper, half torn the corner of an order slip. She bent closer. The handwriting was round and careful, the kind that suggested a young man taught to be precise. Mrs. C. Turner, 1 pound of beef, lean. The rest of the name was smudged away. It wasn't the order that held her attention, though, but the faint imprint of another line beneath it, something written and rubbed out, leaving only a shadow of graphite. She smiled faintly, as if amused by an old memory, and folded the scrap neatly into her purse. The next morning brought new complications. Inspector Mallory arrived from the county station, tall and brisk, with the firm conviction that confusion could be cured by authority. He interviewed Pike in the parlor of his narrow cottage, while the neighbors lingered outside, pretending to prune hedges or shake rugs. "You admit," said Mallory, "that you were the last to see the boy alive." Pike nodded. "He came in early to prepare the delivery orders. I went to the storeroom to fetch new stock. When I came back, he was gone. I thought he'd stepped out for a cigarette." "And your knife?" "It was always on the block," Pike murmured. "Always. But that morning I can't recall moving it. My hands feel wrong without it." Miss Marple, who had been permitted to sit quietly by the window, under the pretense of visiting Mrs. Pike's cousin, observed the way Gerald spoke, not defensive, but dazed. His fingers traced invisible lines on the table, a man trapped inside, some private bewilderment. When Mallory pressed him about motive, the butcher only shook his head. He was a good lad, clumsy with the cleaver, perhaps, but good-hearted. "Why would anyone?" His voice broke. The inspector sighed, closed his notebook, and turned toward Miss Marple with faint irritation. "You've known the people of this village longer than anyone. If you've any thoughts, Miss Marple, I'd welcome them, though I rather suspect this is as simple as a quarrel turned ugly." "Oh, quarrels," she said gently, "rarely end in death, Inspector, unless they uncover something that oughtn't to have been found." Mallory frowned. "Meaning?" She smiled faintly. "Meaning only that young men are not often killed for carelessness. There is usually something else, something someone wished forgotten." Later, as she walked home through the narrow lanes, she pondered the oddness of it all. A butcher's knife gone missing, replaced by another, an apprentice dead without struggle, a man who claimed memory had failed him at the most critical moment, and that curious scrap of paper written twice, as if someone had changed their mind halfway through. In her parlour that evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire knitting, though her eyes were far away. She thought of Pike's trembling hand, of Harold's careful handwriting, and of Mrs. Pike, who had left for Exeter without so much as a note to her husband. People often said absences were accidental, she mused, but in her experience they were the loudest kind of clue. When she finally rose, it was with quiet certainty. Something small, almost trivial, had been overlooked as it always was. Tomorrow she would pay a visit to the telegraph office, inquire after a message sent or not sent to Exeter, and perhaps, while she was there, she might ask after Mrs. C. Turner and her curious order for lean beef. Outside, the village slept under a thin veil of mist, but behind lace, curtains and bolted doors, tongues still wagged, and suspicion thickened like the fog. Miss Marple's window glowed faintly against the dark, a single square of light in a town that would soon discover how much a quiet old lady truly saw. The next morning dawned cold and grey, as if the village itself had grown uneasy beneath the weight of its own whispering. The sign above Pike's shop hung slightly askew, its paint flaking from years of morning frost and afternoon heat. Miss Marple, dressed neatly in her dove-grey coat, took her umbrella more for appearance than necessity. She never liked to seem as though she were on her way to something. People spoke more freely when one appeared to be simply passing by. At the telegraph office, Miss Maud Copley looked up from her counter with the mild suspicion of someone accustomed to knowing everything worth knowing before anyone else. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she chirped, smoothing her hair. "Terrible business about poor Harold. Of course, I always said Mr. Pike worked the boy too hard. And now his wife's gone off. Right when all this happens does make one wonder, doesn't it?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, I'm sure it's all most unfortunate timing," she said, setting her handbag gently on the counter. "I was only wondering if a message ever came through from Mrs. Pike. I believe she's visiting her sister in Exeter." Maud pursed her lips, consulting her logbook with unnecessary ceremony. "Let's see. No, nothing in or out. She hasn't wired home, and Mr. Pike hasn't sent a message either. Of course, some people rely on letters. The postal coach runs late these days, what with the repairs near Barchester." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed. Letters are often more revealing than their senders intend, though I suppose one must write them first." Her eyes softened with that grandmotherly patience which always seemed to make people volunteer what they ought not. Maud hesitated, then leaned forward a little. "Well, there was one message addressed to a Mrs. C. Turner. It came through the evening before the murder, but it wasn't local. It went to the boarding house in Dorking. Curious thing, that. No one by that name here, you see." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her handbag. "Oh, I see," she murmured, almost absently. "And who sent it, I wonder?" "Didn't say. Paid in cash." The handwriting was neat, though a young man's, perhaps. "You're a treasure." She smiled, paid for a sheet of stamps she didn't need, and left before Maud's curiosity could turn its aim elsewhere. As Miss Marple made her way down the lane, her mind moved briskly beneath the calm of her expression. A message to Mrs. Turner, sent the night before the boy's death, and the same name scribbled faintly on that torn order slip. Coincidence, perhaps, but coincidences, in her experience, tended to behave like servants who arrived just in time to overhear what was meant to remain private. At the corner, she nearly collided with Inspector Mallory, who was stepping out of the constable's cottage, looking grim and faintly irritated. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, attempting courtesy. "I was just coming to see you. We've searched Pike's house, found the missing knife in the drawer beneath the pantry table, wiped clean, but for a faint trace of something under the hilt. We'll have it tested." Miss Marple inclined her head. "How fortunate," she said softly. "Though perhaps a little too fortunate, don't you think?" He frowned. "Meaning?" "Oh, nothing." she said, with a faint smile. It's only that murderers seldom tidy so completely and so conveniently. It gives the impression they wish to be discovered, which is, in most cases, absurd. Mallory sighed. You think someone planted it? I think, she said, someone wished to make a frightened man look guilty. And they succeeded admirably, at least for the moment. They walked together a short distance, her pace unhurried, his brisk. We're interviewing the villagers again this afternoon, he said. Pike's neighbor claims to have seen a figure leaving the shop early that morning, someone in a dark coat, moving quickly. But she's half-blind and certain of very little. Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. And who else, Inspector, besides Harold, would have known where Mr. Pike kept his keys? Mallory hesitated. The delivery boy, perhaps. Or Mrs. Pike. She handled the books when she was in town. Yes, she said softly, and she is not in town now. That afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage to pay a polite call on Mrs. Lorimer, who, after years of organizing parish fetes, regarded any scandal as both a moral concern and a form of entertainment. Over tea, the conversation meandered as such conversations always did, from the church's new hymnals to the tragedy at the butcher's. Of course, Mrs. Lorimer said gravely, I always suspected Mrs. Pike was not quite happy. One hears things. That young apprentice was often seen carrying parcels for her when Mr. Pike was away. I dare say she enjoyed the attention. Widows' sisters are not often as far away as Exeter sounds when there's gossip involved. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Affection is a curious thing, she murmured. It so often hides itself beneath convenience. When she left the vicarage, dusk was falling again, and she saw, just near the churchyard, the baker's boy, Tommy, balancing a basket under his arm. She called him over gently. You were delivering to Mr. Pike's, weren't you, the morning before the accident? Yes, miss, he said, eyes wide. Brought a loaf round, like always, but the shop was locked, so I knocked. Mr. Pike came out the back way. Said he'd forgotten his knife. Odd thing, that he never forgets nothing. Looked all muddled, he did. Miss Marple smiled. And did you see young Harold? Tommy frowned, thinking hard. No, miss, but I heard him. Arguing, I think. Not loud, just sharp. Sounded like he was saying someone didn't belong there. Didn't belong, she repeated softly, her mind fitting the phrase into place. Thank you, Tommy. You've been very helpful. That night, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting, the faint tick of the clock keeping time with her thoughts. She pictured the shop, the missing knife, the boy's words, the message to a woman who wasn't local and a wife who had vanished without trace, long before anyone thought to ask where she truly was. It all had the symmetry of deceit carefully rehearsed. Somewhere between the rustle of her needles and the settling of the embers, she saw it clearly. The way guilt often disguised itself as confusion, how a clever hand could move one knife while leaving another as a decoy. She sighed softly, a sound almost affectionate, as though human folly were an old acquaintance she could never quite disapprove of. Tomorrow, she decided, she would visit the station. Perhaps the inspector would let her read the telegraph message herself. People so rarely told the whole truth when they believed it was already written down. The next morning, the rain came softly, the kind that dampened sound and blurred outlines. Street Mead looked quieter than usual, as if the village itself were listening. Miss Marple watched from her window for a moment before setting out, her umbrella neatly angled against the drizzle. She had resolved to visit Inspector Mallory at the station, though she knew very well he would think it another of her kindly intrusions. She did not mind. Men in authority often mistook quietness for irrelevance, which had always suited her rather well. When she arrived, the inspector was bent over his desk, pipe unlit, the air heavy with damp tobacco. He looked up with a weary smile that carried more resignation than welcome. "Good morning, Miss Marple. You've come about our butcher again, I expect." "I came," she replied mildly. because I find I cannot knit comfortably without understanding why someone sends a telegram to a lady who doesn't live here." Mallory frowned. "You mean that business from the telegraph office?" "I've seen it. A message sent to Mrs. C. Turner in Dorking. Read, simply, 'Tomorrow early. All will be ready.' No signature, but the clerk thought it looked like the apprentice's hand." "What of it?" Miss Marple took off her gloves, folding them carefully. "If it was Harold's handwriting, then the question becomes, what, precisely, was to be ready? But if it wasn't, then someone wanted it to seem like Harold's, which is far more interesting." Mallory sighed, rubbing his temples. "You think this Mrs. Turner was mixed up in it somehow?" "I think," she said softly, "that Mrs. Turner may not exist at all, or perhaps she does under another name." She looked out the small window toward the rain-slick street. "Mrs. Pike, for instance, had a Christian name beginning with C, did she not?" The inspector blinked. "Clara Pike. You believe she sent the telegram to herself?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, but her eyes gleamed. "Oh, not to herself, Inspector. That would be foolish. But perhaps someone wished others to believe she had reason to leave. When people disappear conveniently, it's rarely of their own design." Mallory sat back, his irritation fading into thought. "You suspect someone else sent it to make her absence look planned?" "Precisely, which would also explain the curious neatness with which the knife was discovered. A murder staged to look domestic is tidy. By nature, the mess lies only in the motive." He gave a small, grudging nod. "You may be right. We traced Mrs. Pike to the Exeter coach, but no one remembers her arriving. We'll send word to check again." Miss Marple rose. "Do. And while you wait, perhaps it would be wise to have another look at the accounts ledger in the shop. People who keep precise books seldom make arithmetic mistakes unless someone else writes in their stead." By afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the cobbles shining like fish scales under a pale sun. Miss Marple stopped by Pike's shop once more. The constable on duty, seeing her approach, opened the door with a sheepish smile. "Inspector said you might have a look, ma'am. Not that there's much left to see." She nodded her thanks and stepped inside. The air still held the faint tang of cold fat and disinfectant. Behind the counter, the ledger lay open as it had before. She examined it closely, this time rows of careful handwriting, dated and signed with the same rhythmic precision. But then, halfway down the last page, the neat loops gave way to a heavier hand. The figures were correct, yet the slant of the ink leaned leftward instead of right. And beside one entry, Mrs. C. Turner. Beef, £1, paid. The pen had blotted slightly, as if written by someone unaccustomed to the pen's weight. She closed the book slowly, her gaze traveling to the back door where a faint shoeprint had dried into the dust, smaller than Pike's, narrower than Harold's heavy boots. It pointed inward, not outward. That evening, as lamps flickered on across the village, Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Hayward. He was sitting by his fire, polishing his spectacles again, an occupation that always meant he was worried. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with relief. "If you've come to reassure me that I've missed something obvious, please do. The post-mortem shows the cut was made by a right-handed person. Pike's right-handed too, of course, but the angle's wrong, too shallow for a butcher's. Grip. That's very helpful," she said gently. "Was there any trace of binding on the wrists?" "None. No struggle at all. Almost as if the boy didn't expect it." "Yes," she murmured. "People seldom expect betrayal from those they serve tea with." She thanked him, left before he could question further, and walked home beneath the last drizzle of the night. Her fire was burning low when she sat again with her knitting. The rhythm of the needles matched her thoughts. A telegram written in another's hand, a false order under a false name, a missing wife who might never have left. And Harold, whose death had come without struggle, perhaps even without fear. The pattern was forming, thread by thread, and though she could not yet see the full picture, she could feel its shape. Near midnight, She took from her purse the torn slip she had found behind the counter. Under the lamplight, the erased words beneath the order for Mrs. Turner became faintly visible. "Don't come. Changed plan." Miss Marple's lips tightened. Someone had written the first message, then thought better of it, or feared discovery. She looked toward the window, where the mist pressed close against the glass. "So," she whispered, "someone meant for Mrs. Pike to stay away, and someone else meant for her never to return." She folded the slip away, extinguished the lamp, and sat for a moment in the darkness. Outside, a cart rattled faintly down the road, its wheels echoing like the slow beat of time closing in. The old lady listened until the sound faded into silence. Then she smiled to herself, a small, knowing curve of the lips. The game, she decided, was beginning to reveal its player. The morning after Miss Marple's quiet discovery, a pale wind swept through Street Mead, carrying the faint scent of damp hay and chimney smoke. The village was restless. The butcher's shop had remained shuttered, and in its silence, suspicion only grew louder. Mrs. Finch was heard saying she could no longer eat meat without wondering where it came from, and old Mr. Tufnell had told anyone who'd listened that Pike was losing his mind long before the boy was found. The chatter spread like ivy, reaching every sitting room except Miss Marple's, where the air was calm and deliberate. She had spent most of the night thinking about that erased message, "Don't come. Changed plan." The words held the weight of panic, not of guilt. By mid-morning, she decided it was time to see Pike himself. The constable, half asleep at his post outside the cottage, seemed surprised to see her. "He's not said a word since yesterday," he muttered. "Inspector told me to let no one in unless it's official business." Miss Marple gave him her gentlest smile. "Oh, but dear, this is official business only of a rather quieter kind. You wouldn't deny an old lady the chance to offer a word of comfort, would you?" The young man hesitated, then nodded, blushing as he stepped aside. Inside, Pike sat in his armchair by the fire, still in his work trousers, though he looked as though he hadn't slept. His hands, broad and reddened, rested on his knees like heavy stones. When he saw Miss Marple, confusion flickered across his face. "They said I'd done it," he murmured hoarsely, "but I swear to you, Miss Marple, I couldn't have. Harold was like a son to me." She lowered herself into the chair opposite, folding her hands in her lap. "I never thought you did, Mr. Pike, but I do believe someone wished others to think so." He blinked, eyes wet and bewildered. "But why? I've got no enemies. Never quarreled with the boy. He was bright, though too bright sometimes, always asking questions about the books, the orders. I told him not to worry about such things, but he said there were numbers that didn't make sense. I thought it was just his way trying to show he knew more than he did." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly, though her tone remained soft. "And when was that, Mr. Pike?" He rubbed his temples. "The day before it happened." He looked pale, almost frightened, said something about a wrong name in the ledger. I didn't pay him much mind. I thought it was about that Mrs. Turner order. I told him it was a mistake. Miss Marple leaned forward just a little. "But he said someone didn't belong, didn't he?" Tommy the baker's boy overheard. Pike looked startled, then nodded slowly. Yes, that's right. He said she didn't belong. I assumed he meant the customer, but maybe he meant..." His voice trailed off as the thought took shape. "You think it was Clara?" Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She glanced toward the fire, where a small flame struggled against the draught. "I think your wife's disappearance was meant to look planned, but too neatly so. Someone wrote that telegram, perhaps Harold discovered who. It would explain his fear." Pike's eyes widened. "Then they killed him to stop him?" "Possibly, or to stop someone else from being found out." She rose gently. "Mr. Pike, do you have any letters from your wife? Anything with her hand?" He pointed toward a small chest near the stairs. "Top drawer. She wrote once a week, even if she was only visiting her sister. Said it was proper." Miss Marple opened the drawer and withdrew a single folded letter, its envelope smudged with flowery fingerprints. The handwriting was precise and round, unmistakably female. She studied it for a long moment, then took from her handbag the torn slip from the shop. Side by side, the loops and curves spoke plainly. The same hand. "So," she whispered, "Mrs. C. Turner writes very much like Mrs. Clara Pike." That afternoon, Miss Marple walked briskly to the station, her umbrella tapping softly against the cobblestones. She found Inspector Mallory pacing near the telegraph office. "I've had word from Exeter," he said before she could speak. "No sign of Mrs. Pike. Her sister swears she never arrived. We checked the coach lists, no record at all." Dorking, the boarding house that received the telegram. Mallory frowned. "You think she's there?" "I think," she said, "that someone wanted her to be there, in name, if not in person. Perhaps enough to convince the police she'd fled, leaving her husband to shoulder whatever scandal followed." Mallory exhaled sharply. "And you've proof?" She held out the letter and the order slip. "The handwriting matches. The name differs, but the hand does not." He looked at her, half admiring, half frustrated. "Good heavens, Miss Marple. Do you mean she killed the boy herself?" "Oh, not at all," she said lightly. "Mrs. Pike may be many things, but she's not foolish enough to leave a trail she herself could be linked to. No. Someone used her absence as a curtain to hide behind, and I think Harold may have pulled it aside." Mallory stared at her, brow furrowed. "Then who?" She smiled faintly. "Tell me, Inspector, has anyone considered the delivery boy from the poultry farm? The one who comes every Wednesday? I noticed his handwriting once, on a crate. Very tidy. Too tidy, for a man who claims not to read." The inspector blinked. "You mean Leonard Pratt? He delivered the chickens the day before the murder." "Yes," she said softly. "And, according to Mrs. Lorimer, he'd been seen walking with Mrs. Pike more than once, when her husband was away. People dismiss such things as gossip, but gossip, Inspector, is simply truth that has taken a different route." By evening, as the constable was dispatched to find Leonard Pratt, Miss Marple returned home, her mind quiet but alert. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows. She sat by her fire again, the flames reflecting in her eyes. "Affection," she murmured to herself, "can be as dangerous as hate when it chooses the wrong disguise." She knew the next day would bring questions, confessions, perhaps even tears. But tonight, as the clock struck 10, she allowed herself a small sigh of satisfaction. The pattern was almost complete. There remained only one stitch to tighten the one that would draw the murderer out from beneath the fabric of lies they had so carefully sewn. The following morning broke with a heavy stillness, as though the village itself sensed that something momentous was drawing near. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual and took her tea in the garden, her mind as calm as her manner. The scent of damp soil and roses mingled faintly in the air. Yet beneath the peace of street, Mead, there was a murmur of expectancy, the quiet hum that precedes revelation. By the time she reached the high street, the constable was already stationed outside Pike's shop again, his boots wet from the dew. Inside the station, Inspector Mallory stood near the window, his expression tight and unsmiling. "They found him," he said without preamble as Miss Marple entered. "Leonard Pratt. We picked him up near the canal. Claimed he was just passing through, but he had a train ticket to Dover in his pocket. Says he's been saving for months, though the bank records show he drew nearly £10 last week. He's being held now." Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly, her eyes thoughtful. £10 is quite a sum for a delivery boy. I imagine he doesn't make that in a fortnight." Mallory nodded grimly. "We've searched his lodgings. Nothing much there except this." He handed her a small folded paper. Inside was a crude drawing of a heart, split by a knife. Beneath it, written in a surprisingly elegant hand, were the words, "All will be ready." Miss Marple studied it for a moment, her lips pressed together. "The same phrase used in the telegram," she murmured. A curious kind of repetition, almost as though it had meaning for him beyond its words. Mallory leaned on the desk. "We think he was having an affair with Mrs. Pike. Perhaps she promised to run away with him, then changed her mind. Harold found out, tried to warn Pike, and Pratt silenced him." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "A plausible story, Inspector, but human motives rarely fit into such neat compartments. If Leonard loved her, why would he write the telegram that would send her away? A man driven by jealousy might act rashly, yes, but not so tidily." He frowned. "You believe there's someone else behind it?" "I believe," she said softly, "that Leonard Pratt was a pawn who mistook himself for a player. Someone gave him instructions, and he obeyed them without fully understanding the purpose. The handwriting on that note is his, but the phrasing that has a different ring. Almost clerical." Mallory sighed. "You mean someone dictated it?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps he copied it, as one might copy a message he was told to deliver." She looked out the window, where a light drizzle blurred the glass. If Mrs. Pike was indeed involved with him, then she trusted him. And trust, Inspector, is the most useful tool a manipulator can possess. That afternoon, Mallory allowed Miss Marple to sit quietly in the adjoining room, as Leonard Pratt was questioned. The young man sat stiffly at the table, his hands clasped tight, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. "I didn't mean for anyone to die," he kept saying. "It wasn't my fault." Mallory's tone was even but cold. "Then whose fault was it, Pratt? You delivered the telegram. You were seen outside Pike's shop that morning. The knife was hidden in your poultry crate." Leonard's voice cracked. "She said it would be all right. She said no one would get hurt. I just had to keep Harold quiet, that's all. He found out she was planning to go." "Mrs. Pike?" Mallory asked quickly. Leonard hesitated, then looked down. "Yes, but not alone. There was a man. Came from the next parish. Said he'd known her before she married. I didn't like him, slick sort, always watching her like she was something he'd already owned. She said he could give her a better life. I only wanted to help." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver as she listened. Her knitting needles were still in her lap, untouched. "A man from the next parish," she murmured when the interrogation paused. "Would you remember his name?" Leonard swallowed hard. "She called him Mr. Carter, but I don't think that was his real name. He said things only Pike's wife could have told him." That evening, the inspector and Miss Marple walked the narrow lane leading to the old coaching road that connected Street Mead to the next parish. The air was crisp, the clouds breaking to reveal a dull wash of silver moonlight. "We'll find this Carter," Mallory said firmly. "If he exists, he'll have left a trail." Miss Marple nodded, her pace steady. "He exists, Inspector, but perhaps not in the form you imagine. You see, deceit has a peculiar way of folding in on itself. I suspect that Mr. Carter is not new to Mrs. Pike at all. I think she has known him for many years." Mallory gave her a sidelong glance. "You mean he's someone from the village?" "Someone who could move about without question," she replied. "Someone who would know Pike's habits, who could enter his shop unnoticed, who could persuade Harold to trust him even for a moment. It would explain how Harold was taken by surprise. He knew the killer." By the time they reached the edge of the road, Mallory's steps had slowed. "Good Lord, Miss Marple, you can't mean—" "I do," she said quietly. "Dr. Haywood." The inspector stopped short. "The doctor? But why on earth?" "Because he has debts," she said softly. "And charm. And a widow's confidence. Mrs. Pike's husband trusted him. Harold confided in him. He was in the shop the morning of the murder after all. He declared the boy dead." But who is to say he didn't arrive earlier? Who would question a doctor's presence where death soon followed? Mallory was silent for a long moment. "If you're wrong, I rarely am," she said gently. "But you'll have to see it for yourself. He will not run. He is too proud. Pride, you know, is the most visible disguise for guilt." They parted under the dim glow of the gas lamp, and Miss Marple returned home, her mind settled. As she sat once more by her fire, she thought of the doctor's polished words, his calm hands, and the faint tremor she had noticed when she'd asked about the cut's angle. He had said it was shallow, the kind of cut made by a man not accustomed to cleavers, but very familiar with scalpels. She closed her eyes, her face serene. The rain began again, soft against the window pane, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled. Tomorrow, she thought, would bring the truth and the quiet reckoning that always followed it. The morning began with a brittle chill, the kind that made the air seem sharper than usual. Miss Marple had hardly slept, though she rose with her usual composure. The calm of someone who had already seen the outline of the truth, but was waiting patiently for the world to catch up. Outside, the church bell tolled softly, echoing through the damp air as she stepped out onto the lane. By mid-morning, Inspector Mallory had sent a constable to fetch Dr. Hayward under the pretext of assisting with a new statement from Pike. Miss Marple, of course, had suggested the plan herself, not out of deceit, but necessity. She knew that the truth, when close enough to exposure, often revealed itself through the smallest crack of composure. When Dr. Hayward arrived at the station, his manner was impeccably calm. He greeted Mallory courteously, nodded to Miss Marple with the polite half-smile of a man confident in his respectability, and removed his gloves as though preparing for a routine consultation. "I understand there are new developments?" he asked, his voice smooth, with that practiced steadiness that came from years of reassuring patience. Mallory gestured to the chair opposite him. "There are, Doctor. Leonard Pratt's confession has brought new details to light. We thought it best you hear them." Hayward settled himself, folding one leg neatly over the other. "Confession? I find that rather improbable. The boy is slow-witted and impressionable, hardly the type to plan anything." Miss Marple watched him closely, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her knitting untouched beside her. "Quite right, Doctor," she said gently. "He was no planner, only a participant in a story written by someone cleverer, someone who knew precisely how to use fear and affection to achieve his ends." For a fraction of a second, something in the doctor's expression tightened a minute twitch near the corner of his mouth, but it was gone almost as soon as it appeared. "You think Leonard was manipulated?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said softly, "by someone who knew just how to appear indispensable, someone who could move freely, unchallenged, into the home of any resident under the pretext of care. Someone who could tell when a frightened boy had seen too much, and who understood that a death declared natural would never be questioned except by those with sharper eyes." Mallory shifted slightly, glancing toward her as if unsure whether to intervene. The doctor's composure remained, though his tone hardened. "Surely, Miss Marple, you can't be suggesting I had anything to do with that poor boy's death. I was called after the discovery. You saw me there yourself." "Yes," she said, her voice quiet, almost kind. "And I noticed how very quickly you confirmed the time of death, before even checking the body closely. You said 2 or 3 hours earlier, though the blood had already dried. Rather odd for a man of medicine to make such an assumption without examination. But of course, you already knew when he died." There was a long pause. Mallory's eyes flicked from her to the doctor, waiting. Hayward leaned back slightly, his face pale but still controlled. "You speak of assumptions, Miss Marple, yet you base yours entirely on speculation." She smiled faintly. "Speculation has its uses, Doctor, when it begins with human behavior. You see, guilt is a terrible actor, it forgets its lines. The night before the murder, you told Constable Dawlish that you'd been home after 9. Yet Mrs. Lorimer's maid saw you walking toward Pike's shop not long after 10, carrying your medical bag. One might ask why. But the answer, I think, lies with Mrs. Pike. Mallory straightened. You've evidence of that? Miss Marple's eyes softened, though they did not leave the doctor's face. Only what's already before us. Mrs. Pike was no runaway. She was frightened. Frightened enough to send a message to Dorking not to flee, but to protect herself. She had found out her husband's accounts were being tampered with. Someone had been taking money under her name in small, careful sums. She thought Harold had done it, but he, poor boy, discovered the truth instead, that it was the doctor who'd used Pike's trust to settle his own debts. Harold confronted him the morning of the murder, and because you were clever, doctor, you used Pike's own knife, then returned later to declare the cause of death and place suspicion precisely where you wanted it. For the first time, doctor, Haywood's mask faltered. The faintest flush crept up his neck, and he reached for his gloves again, though his hands trembled slightly. This is absurd. You have no proof. Mallory's voice was measured. We'll find it. The boy's handwriting on the ledger pages has already been examined. The forged entries match your prescriptions. And the telegram clerk remembers your voice, doctor. You sent that message yourself. The room was very still. Outside, a cart rumbled faintly along the cobbles, the sound muffled by rain. Doctor. Haywood's hand froze on the gloves. His lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its smoothness. I told her to go, that I'd settle things here and follow. But the boy found the ledger. He said he'd tell Pike. He would have ruined everything. I only meant to frighten him. It wasn't supposed to. His voice broke off, and for the first time, Miss Marple looked almost sorrowful. Murder never is, she said softly. It begins as a moment of desperation and ends as a lifetime of remembering. Mallory nodded to the constable waiting outside. When they led the doctor away, the sound of his footsteps faded quickly down the corridor, leaving the air thick with the finality of truth. Miss Marple stood, collecting her knitting with a small sigh. You see, Inspector, she said as they stepped into the pale morning light, evil seldom announces itself with drama. It prefers the quiet corners, the kindly smiles, the steady hands. Mallory looked at her with a mix of respect and disbelief. How on earth do you see what none of us can? She smiled faintly, adjusting her hat against the drizzle. Oh, one learns a great deal from people's tea habits and their silences. Death, you see, always leaves a shadow, but it's the living who cast it. She walked home through the mist, her figure small and steady against the soft grey of the lane, while street Mead, at last, began to exhale its long-held breath. The village of Street Mead woke that day with a strange hush. Word had already reached every doorstep that Dr. Haywood had been taken away. And though few dared speak his name aloud, there was a nervous energy in the air, as though the quiet streets themselves were waiting to learn how such wickedness could have lived so near. By mid-morning, the usual rhythm of deliveries, shop doors, and church bells resumed. But voices remained subdued, glancing sideways at every shadow that passed. Miss Marple, however, was not content to let the day close on gossip. Truth, she knew, did not end at a confession. It lingered, asking to be tidied away, as every bit of human disorder ought to be. She arrived at the station shortly after noon. Inspector Mallory was behind his desk, reading through a new report with the weary satisfaction of a man whose burden had lightened but not yet lifted. He's admitted most of it, Mallory said when she entered. Says it began with debts to a London supplier, small at first, then enough to ruin him. He forged Pike's accounts to cover them, then found himself caught when Harold noticed. Pike's wife threatened to go to the authorities, so he planned to send her away under another name. The telegram, the forged order, all of it. When the boy confronted him, he panicked. He rubbed his brow and exhaled. We'll have him before the magistrate by week's end. Miss Marple sat quietly, gloved hands folded. It was very neat of him. she said after a moment. He almost succeeded. But I can't help thinking there's one piece still out of place. Mallory looked up. One piece? She nodded. Mrs. Pike. The inspector frowned. We've sent for her sister. She's safe in Exeter. Seems she took another coach the following day. Perhaps she meant to come back. Perhaps not. Either way, she's no longer in danger. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the rain-spattered window. I wonder, she said softly. A woman running from scandal often hides in sight, not in distance. She may not have wished the world to see her shame or her relief. There is a certain look in a woman's eye when she knows the storm has passed, yet fears what calm will bring. That afternoon, she decided to walk beyond the edge of the village, where the hedgerows grew high and uneven, concealing the narrow footpath toward the river. She carried no umbrella despite the damp, only her handbag and an old walking stick. Near the bend by the mill, she found Mrs. Pike sitting on a low stone wall, her coat buttoned to the throat and her hands trembling as she rolled a cigarette she did not light. You needn't rise, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. I'm not the constable. Clara Pike looked up, her eyes swollen but dry. I thought they'd send someone. I heard the news this morning, they say he confessed. Yes, Miss Marple replied, but I came to ask whether you have forgiven yourself yet. The woman flinched. Myself? I didn't kill anyone. No, Miss Marple said quietly. But you knew. You must have known long before Harold did. Women see these things, the missing coins, the sudden worry behind a practiced smile. You knew the doctor was taking from the accounts, and you knew why he lingered when your husband was away. Yet you said nothing, perhaps out of pity, perhaps fear. Clara Pike's lips trembled. He said he'd fix it, that it was temporary. When Harold found out, he begged me to speak to my husband before the boy did. I was too ashamed. I thought if I went away for a few days, it would all settle, but it didn't, did it? Miss Marple laid a hand lightly over hers. It never does. Silence only stretches the tragedy. Still, you did what you thought merciful. Few of us are brave in the moment we should be. For a time they sat listening to the river. Then Clara Pike whispered, Will they hang him? I expect so, Miss Marple said softly. But the law, it will do what conscience could not. That's its only purpose, really to tidy what hearts have already broken. When Miss Marple returned to the village, dusk had fallen. The lamps along the high street glowed pale against the mist, and the butcher's window was dark for the first time in years. She paused there, looking at the reflection of her small figure in the glass, and thought of the life that would return slowly to normal of Pike, released but broken, of Clara, who would never again meet her neighbor's eyes, of young Harold, whose name would be whispered kindly in church pews for a season, then fade into the quiet rhythm of the village. That night she wrote a brief note for Inspector Mallory. Enclosing the torn slip, she had kept the one that read, Don't come, changed plan. She asked that it be returned to Pike, should he wish to keep it. He ought to have one reminder, she murmured, sealing the envelope. Not of murder, but of misunderstanding. Later, as she sat by the fire with her knitting, the church clock struck 11. The air smelled faintly of rain and wood smoke. She thought of how evil so rarely announced itself with thunder or lightning, but crept instead through ordinary doors. A forged figure in a ledger, a misplaced affection, a moment's cowardice, and she thought, not for the first time, how fragile goodness truly was, how it depended on small choices, on quiet honesty, on the courage to speak before the silence turned deadly. When the last ember fell, she folded her knitting, extinguished the lamp, and looked once more through the window toward the darkened street. The village slept peacefully again, but she knew that somewhere, behind another curtained window, another story of human frailty was already beginning to unfold. She smiled faintly, a tired but knowing smile, and whispered to the night as if it were an old confidant, Well then, until the next one. Outside, the mist thickened, softening every sound, the world of street. Mead resumed its quiet rhythm as it always did, carrying within it the memory of one more tragedy understood, one more evil quietly undone by the gentle persistence of an old woman who never stopped listening. The days that followed brought an uneasy quiet to Street Mead. The villagers, ever quick to fill silences with speculation, soon found the story shifting from shock to faint embarrassment, as though a scandal too long discussed might stain the respectability of the place itself. The butcher's shop reopened, though only partially, with Pike moving through his duties like a man walking through fog. Clara was seen once at the post office, head bowed beneath her hat, her face drawn but composed. People whispered that she would leave soon, perhaps for Exeter after all, though no one asked her directly. It was easier to let time wash over tragedy than to examine what remained. Something faint but persistent lingered, an uneasiness that refused to fade, as if one small thread had been left untied. She felt it most when she saw Pike one afternoon, standing outside his shop in the wan light. His face bore no anger, only weariness. "They tell me I'm free," he said quietly when she stopped beside him. "But it doesn't feel that way. Every cut of meat I make, I see the boy's face. I keep wondering if I could have stopped it somehow if I'd paid more attention." Miss Marple's gaze was kind. "Grief makes detectives of us all, Mr. Pike. We search for what we missed, long after it's too late to matter." She hesitated, then added softly, "Did you ever find your old knife?" He shook his head. "No. They say the doctor used one from the shop, but not mine. The one I inherited from my father, silver handle, worn smooth. Vanished, and I can't think where it could have gone." Miss Marple's expression barely changed, though a flicker passed behind her eyes. "No one returned it to you?" "No, ma'am. And I looked everywhere, even in the drains behind the shop. It's gone for good, I suppose." That night, as she sat before the fire, Miss Marple thought again about the knife. It was a small detail, one the police had overlooked once the doctor confessed, but small details were often where truth liked to hide. The silver-handled knife, its absence nagged at her like a faint melody she could not place. It had not been found in the doctor's possession, nor mentioned in his confession. Why steal something so distinctive, so traceable? Unless, of course, it had never been in his hands at all. The next morning, she walked down to the constable's office, a basket of scones in hand, and found young Dawlish sorting papers. He straightened at once when he saw her. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Everything's settled now, thank the Lord." "Settled things have a curious way of unsettling themselves," she said pleasantly, placing the basket down. "Tell me, Dawlish, in all your searching, did anyone ever examine the contents of Dr. Haywood's medical bag?" He blinked. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Empty except for his instruments. Scalpel, forceps, vials, all accounted for." "And those instruments, were they silver?" "No, steel mostly." "Why?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, no reason. I was merely thinking how some tools serve more than one purpose." She thanked him and went on her way, leaving the young man more puzzled than before. That afternoon, she took her usual walk to the churchyard, where the air carried the faint scent of rain and cut grass. She paused near Harold Price's grave, where a small wooden cross stood until the headstone could be carved. A few wildflowers, wilted now, lay at its base. As she knelt to straighten them, she noticed something half buried in the soft earth beside the boundary hedge. A glint of dull silver, smudged with soil. Her breath caught softly as she brushed the dirt away. It was a knife, not a kitchen blade, but a butcher's, its handle worn smooth, engraved faintly with the initials G.P. She turned it over in her gloved hands. The edge was dull, no trace of blood now, but she saw what others had not, a faint nick along the hilt, where something sharp had struck metal. A blow deflected, perhaps, rather than delivered. She looked toward the church path, where the ground sloped toward the back gate that led to the vicarage garden. Whoever had dropped it had done so hastily, maybe in darkness, meaning to hide it but not daring to dig deep. That evening she called on Inspector Mallory once more. He listened as she placed the knife on his desk. "Good heavens," he said. "Pike's knife? Where did you find it?" "In the churchyard," she said softly. "By the hedge, not buried properly." Mallory stared at it, frowning. But if the doctor killed the boy, how would the knife end up there? Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost sorrowful. "Because he didn't. Oh, he was guilty of theft, of deceit, of cowardice, but not of murder. I believe the confession was a desperate man's bargain for peace. He thought by claiming the crime he could protect someone else." Mallory looked sharply at her. "Protect? Whom?" She met his eyes steadily. "Mrs. Pike." The inspector's face darkened. "You think she?" "I think she found out about Harold that morning. Perhaps he confronted her first, not the doctor. Perhaps he accused her of helping in the fraud, or worse, of betraying her husband. She had the knife to defend herself, or perhaps to frighten him, but things go wrong so easily when fear takes the lead. The cut was shallow, wasn't it? Not a butcher's blow, not deliberate, more the strike of someone terrified. And afterward, she ran. The doctor found the body, realized what had happened, and took the blame to spare her. He had loved her once, after all. Mallory sat back heavily. "If you're right, she's walking free." "Freedom is a strange thing, Inspector. I doubt it feels that way to her. She'll live with what she did, far longer than any prison sentence." Outside, the evening light dimmed to gold. Mallory turned the knife over, silent. Finally he said, "We'll question her tomorrow." Miss Marple nodded, though her gaze was distant, fixed on the last sliver of sun fading through the window. "Be gentle with her," she murmured. "Guilt already has her in its keeping." As she walked home, the sky grew darker, and the wind rustled through the hedges like a whisper. The case, she knew, would close soon enough. But closure was not the same as peace. In street, Mead, nothing ever vanished entirely, not the truth, not the whispers, and certainly not the quiet ache of what might have been prevented if someone had spoken sooner. The next morning broke in shades of pale grey, the kind that made every sound seem louder: the sweep of a broom, the call of a milk cart, even the toll of the church bell carried farther than usual. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, her teapot steaming gently beside her, and watched the mist drift past the window. The events of the previous night had not surprised her, they rarely did, but the weight of understanding still lingered, pressing lightly on her thoughts like fog on glass. There was truth now, almost within reach. But she knew the final step would require more than evidence. It would need tenderness, and that was always the most difficult kind of justice. Inspector Mallory came just before 10, his coat still damp from the drizzle. "We've done as you said," he told her, accepting a cup of tea without being asked. "Questioned Mrs. Pike this morning. She denies everything. Calm as you please, too, says she never saw the knife after her husband lost it. When we mentioned Harold, she only said she pitied the boy." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, eyes lowered. "Pity is a curious emotion, Inspector. It can look very much like remorse, especially when one doesn't know the difference." Mallory exhaled, rubbing the rim of his hat. "If she's lying, she's the steadiest liar I've ever seen. We've no proof beyond that knife, and even that could have been dropped by anyone. The doctor's dead, after all, and the case is officially closed." "Closed," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes, how quickly people like to close doors when the room still smells of something unpleasant." Mallory gave her a sharp look. "You're certain, then?" "Certain it was her." She met his gaze steadily. "Not certain. Certainty is the privilege of men who arrest, not of women who observe. But I believe she struck him, not in hatred, but in panic. She saw in Harold's accusation the ruin of everything she'd tried to preserve. Her reputation, her marriage, perhaps even her self-respect. Panic makes us brutal. Inspector, It makes us capable of anything." He nodded slowly, though his expression was grim. "If she did it, she's paying for it already. She's leaving the village tomorrow. Took a room with a cousin in the north. Pike's selling the shop." Miss Marple looked down at her cup. "Leaving," she murmured. "Yes, that's what the guilty always do. They run, thinking the world will forgive them if they change the view from their window. But guilt travels light. It always catches up." Later that afternoon, she decided to walk once more past Pike's shop. The shutters were half closed now, and the counter inside had been cleared. Through the window, she saw Pike packing small parcels into a crate, his knives wrapped in linen, his apron folded with care. When he noticed her outside, he opened the door, his face weary but kind. "You've done more for me than I can say, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "The inspector told me about the knife. I suppose it doesn't matter now who truly did it." "Nothing can bring the boy back." Miss Marple regarded him gently. "Truth always matters, Mr. Pike. It may not heal the wound, but it stops it from festering. You mustn't let silence do what deceit already has." He hesitated, then sighed. "She's leaving tonight. Said it's for my sake that I deserve peace." "I don't know what I deserve anymore." Miss Marple reached out and laid a hand on his arm. "Peace, my dear, is not given. It's earned often painfully, and never without forgiveness." When evening fell, the village gathered itself into that muffled quiet that always came before rain. Miss Marple sat by her fire, the small clock ticking gently on the mantel, and listened to the faint hum of the world outside. At 9:30, there came a knock at her door, soft, hesitant. When she opened it, Clara Pike stood there, her face pale beneath her traveling hat, a single suitcase in her hand. "I couldn't go," she said in a trembling voice, "not without speaking to you." Miss Marple stepped aside, guiding her into the warm lamplight. "Sit down, my dear. You must be cold." Clara set the case down but did not sit. "I can't live with it," she whispered. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him, that boy, falling. I didn't mean to hurt him. He said dreadful things that he'd tell everyone about the accounts, that my husband would think I'd been part of it. I tried to stop him, just for a moment. He grabbed me, and then..." She stopped, her breath shaking. "It was so fast, I didn't even feel it. And when I saw the blood..." Miss Marple crossed the room and gently took her hands. "Hush now. You needn't tell it again." "I understand." Clara's tears fell silently. "I thought if I ran, it would fade. But everywhere I went, I saw his face. And the doctor he tried to help. He said he'd make it right, that no one would ever know. But when they took him away, I realized what I'd done. I killed 2 people, really. One with fear, and one with silence." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "You've lived in a prison of your own making, Clara. It's time to leave it properly. Go to the inspector, tell him the truth. The law will be merciful when the heart has already confessed." Clara wiped her eyes. "Will it matter now?" "It always matters," Miss Marple said gently, "because until you speak it, the truth belongs to no one. And you, my dear, deserve to lay it down." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock and the rain beginning against the windows. Then Clara nodded faintly. "I'll go in the morning." Miss Marple accompanied her to the door and watched as she disappeared into the misty lane, her figure small and uncertain but somehow lighter. When she turned back to her fire, the old detective allowed herself a sigh, not of triumph, but of quiet sorrow. The next day, word spread quickly that Mrs. Pike had gone to the station at first light and turned herself in. By noon, Mead was already weaving a new story, one of tragedy softened by contrition, one that would soon settle into the folds of village memory like all the others. That evening, Miss Marple stood at her window, looking out over the rooftops, silvered by rain. The world, she thought, had a curious way of returning to stillness, even after terrible noise. Somewhere below, A child laughed, a cart rattled, and the faint smell of bread drifted through the air. Life, ever indifferent, went on. She smiled faintly, drew the curtains and murmured to herself, "People are much the same everywhere, capable of great kindness and of quiet cruelty. The trick is knowing which you're looking at before it's too late." Then she turned down the lamp, the fire crackling softly behind her, and the little house of street Mead sank once more into its habitual peace. The end.